What if the coldest heart could be warmed by a child's smile? It's a question that probes deep into the human condition, challenging the notion that wealth and power are the ultimate sources of fulfillment. This is the story of Adrian Faulkner, a man whose life had been meticulously crafted around the acquisition of money, influence, and control, until the night he stumbled upon two abandoned children who would forever change the course of his existence. This story begins not in the boardrooms of towering skyscrapers, where Adrian was most at home, but on a cold, forgotten street corner where fate intervened in the most unexpected way. Adrian Faulkner was the kind of man who inspired both admiration and fear. To the world, he was a symbol of success, a billionaire who had built an empire with his bare hands, his intellect, and his ruthlessness. His rise to power had been nothing short of meteoric, the result of a singular focus on wealth accumulation and dominance. Yet behind the carefully constructed image of opulence lay a man disconnected from the very things that once mattered to him. Friends, family, love, all had taken a back seat to the insatiable drive for more. This wasn't always the case. Once Adrian had cared deeply, had known the warmth of companionship and the thrill of genuine human connection. But all that had changed when his partnership with Victor Armitage, a man he had once considered a brother, fell apart in a blaze of betrayal. Victor, once Adrian's closest confidant and co-architect of their mutual success, had turned against him, choosing greed and corruption over loyalty. The bitterness of that betrayal had hardened Adrian, closing him off emotionally and leaving him to focus solely on his business ventures. Trust, to Adrian, was now a commodity he could no longer afford. That night, when Adrian walked the dimly lit streets after an exhausting day of negotiations and meetings, his mind was consumed by thoughts of another lucrative deal on the horizon. It was a night like any other, or so he believed. The wind cut through the city, sharp and biting, reminding him that winter was fast approaching. He didn't particularly care for the cold. After all, he had the means to escape it whenever he pleased. A private jet to a tropical island, a heated penthouse, nothing was out of reach for a man of his stature. Yet there was something in the air that night, something unsettling that tugged at the edge of his awareness. As he made his way past an alleyway, he noticed something unusual. Two small figures huddled together under a tattered blanket, trying desperately to keep warm against the cold. At first, he dismissed it, accustomed to seeing the less fortunate scattered across the city's streets. He had grown numb to such sights over the years, his heart too calloused to register the plight of those living in poverty. But as he passed by, a soft sound reached his ears, a cry, faint yet piercing. It was the sound of a baby. Something inside Adrian made him stop. He turned and looked again. One of the figures was a child, no older than 7 or 8, cradling an infant in his arms. The older child's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, but it was the baby's feeble cries that broke through the fortress Adrian had built around his heart. For a moment, he stood frozen, torn between the instinct to keep walking and the uncharacteristic urge to help. "Please, sir," the older child said, his voice trembling. "We don't know where to go. My brother, he's cold." Adrian wasn't the type to indulge in moments of sentimentality. His entire life had been built on logic, on decisions made for profit, not out of kindness. Yet there was something in the boy's eyes that stirred a long-buried part of him, a part that remembered what it felt like to care, to protect. He didn't know why, but before he could stop himself, he approached the children. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. The boy flinched, but held his ground. We were left here," the boy stammered. "My mum said she'd be back, but she didn't come. That was yesterday." Adrian felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Empathy, perhaps, or maybe guilt. These children had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves in the freezing cold. He looked around, half expecting someone else to appear, a parent or guardian who might have simply lost their way. But there was no one. Just the boy, the baby, and the biting wind. For a moment, he considered calling the authorities. It would be the logical thing to do, the responsible thing. After all, what business did he have taking in 2 abandoned children? He wasn't equipped to handle this, and it certainly wasn't his problem. But as he looked at the baby, shivering and whimpering in his brother's arms, something shifted inside him. He couldn't leave them there, not tonight.
"Come with me," he said abruptly, surprising even himself. The boy's eyes widened in shock. "Really? You'll help us?"
Adrian nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. He had no plan, no idea how this would unfold. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away, not now. He led them to his waiting car, gesturing for them to get inside. The boy hesitated for a moment, clutching the baby protectively, but eventually climbed into the back seat. As they drove through the city, Adrian found himself glancing at the children in the rearview mirror. The baby had fallen silent, now peacefully asleep in the boy's arms, while the older child stared out the window, too tired or too afraid to speak. Adrian didn't ask any questions. He didn't need to, not yet. The children's presence in his car, in his life, was already upending everything he thought he knew about himself. When they arrived at his mansion, the contrast between their shabby appearances and the opulence of his home couldn't have been starker. The boy looked around in awe, clearly overwhelmed by the sheer size and luxury of the place. Adrian, on the other hand, was already thinking ahead. What now? He had no experience with children, no idea how to care for them. His world was one of order, efficiency, and structure, none of which applied to the situation he now found himself in. But something had shifted in Adrian that night. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than cold ambition. The children, Liam and Oliver, had unknowingly awakened a part of him that he had long since buried. And though he didn't yet realize it, this was the beginning of a journey that would lead him down a path he never thought possible, a journey of love, redemption, and transformation. The man who once believed that success could only be measured by wealth and power was about to discover that true wealth lay not in what he had, but in the lives he was about to change forever. Adrian Faulkner had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control. Control over his business, over his public image, and most importantly, over his emotions. He was a man of precision, someone who believed that everything in life could be measured, calculated, and conquered. His vast wealth, his meticulously organized empire, and the impenetrable walls around his personal life were testaments to his mastery over his own fate. But on that cold, fateful night, as 2 vulnerable children sat in his mansion, bundled in blankets that dwarfed their small frames, Adrian felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. He stood in the doorway of the living room, watching them. Liam, the older boy, was wide awake, his eyes darting around the luxurious surroundings with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He clutched his younger brother Oliver tightly to his chest, as if afraid that if he loosened his grip, the world would snatch him away. The baby had finally settled, sleeping peacefully in the crook of his brother's arm, completely unaware of the turmoil swirling around him. Adrian had dealt with hostile takeovers, legal battles, and high-stakes negotiations, but this was different. This was human, raw and real in a way that nothing in his carefully curated life had ever been. He cleared his throat, drawing Liam's attention. The boy stiffened, his grip on Oliver tightening, eyes wary. "You're safe here," Adrian said, though he wasn't entirely sure what safe meant anymore. "No one's gonna hurt you." Liam's eyes, so much older than they should have been, remained fixed on Adrian. There was no immediate trust, no relief in his gaze. Only a deep, ingrained fear that had no place in the eyes of a child. It took Adrian aback, more than he would have liked to admit. How long had this boy been carrying the weight of the world on his small shoulders? And why? "Thank you," Liam said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, as though he was afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile sanctuary they had found. Adrian nodded, not knowing what else to say. The silence between them stretched on, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. He wasn't used to silence, not like this. His world was filled with noise, the hum of machinery, the murmur of boardroom discussions, the constant buzz of his phone with notifications of stock prices and business updates. But this silence was different. It was expectant, heavy with the unspoken fear and uncertainty of what would come next. "Are you hungry?" Adrian asked awkwardly. The question felt trivial, out of place in the gravity of the moment, but he didn't know where else to start.
Liam hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Oliver. He needs food."
Adrian turned to one of his staff, who had been hovering in the background, unsure of how to proceed with their employer's sudden and unexpected guests. "Get them something to eat, whatever they need." The servant nodded quickly and disappeared into the kitchen. Adrian could tell by the furtive glances exchanged among the staff that they were as confused as he was. They were used to handling Adrian's high-powered business associates, not frightened children. This was uncharted territory for all of them. He walked over and sat down in the armchair across from Liam, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Liam watched him carefully, every muscle in his small body tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Adrian found himself wondering how long the boy had been living like this, constantly on edge, constantly afraid. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Adrian asked gently, though he already knew the answer. If they had a home, they wouldn't be here, huddled under a blanket on the streets, but he needed to hear it from Liam. He needed to understand what had happened to these children and why they had been abandoned. Liam's eyes flickered with something, pain perhaps, or shame. He looked down at Oliver, avoiding Adrian's gaze. "No, sir. We were waiting for our mum, but she didn't come back." There it was. The truth, spoken in a child's voice but heavy with the weight of abandonment. Adrian felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't used to emotions, at least not the kind that made him feel vulnerable. He dealt in facts, in numbers, in things that could be quantified and controlled. But this was something he couldn't calculate. The fear in Liam's voice, the helplessness that radiated from him, it stirred something deep within Adrian, something he had long since buried. "Where did she leave you?" Adrian asked, his voice more measured now, trying to piece together the puzzle of what had brought these children to his doorstep. Liam shifted uncomfortably. "At the bus station. She said she had to go get something, but she didn't come back."
Adrian's mind raced. A bus station? That was no place for a child, let alone a baby. The image of these two boys alone in a grimy bus terminal, surrounded by strangers and danger, made his stomach churn. How long had they been waiting? How long had they been afraid, abandoned by the one person who was supposed to protect them?
For a moment, Adrian considered calling the police. It was the logical thing to do. They were, after all, the ones trained to handle situations like this. They could take the boys into custody, find them a place in the system, maybe even reunite them with their mother, if she ever came back. But as the thought crossed his mind, he glanced at Liam, at the way the boy held his brother so protectively, so desperately, and he knew he couldn't do it. The idea of sending them away, of putting them into a system that might tear them apart, filled him with a sense of dread he couldn't quite explain. "You'll stay here tonight," Adrian said, the decision made before he could second-guess it. "We'll figure everything out in the morning." Liam's eyes widened in disbelief. "We can stay?" "Yes," Adrian said firmly. "You're safe here." For the first time, Liam's shoulders relaxed just a little, though the wariness in his eyes never fully disappeared. Adrian knew that trust wouldn't come easily, not after what these boys had been through, but it was a start, however small. The food arrived shortly after, a simple meal of soup and sandwiches. Liam ate slowly, cautiously, as though he was afraid it might be taken away at any moment. Adrian watched silently, his mind a swirl of thoughts. What had happened to these boys? Where was their mother? And why had she left them in such a dangerous situation? As the children ate, Adrian's mind drifted back to his own childhood, a time he rarely allowed himself to think about. He had grown up in a house that was cold, not because of the lack of heat, but because of the lack of love. His father had been a hard man, focused only on work and success, much like Adrian had become. His mother had been distant, consumed by her own unhappiness. There had been no warmth, no comfort, no one to turn to when the world felt too big and too scary. He had learned early on that the only person he could rely on was himself. In many ways, Adrian had become the very man he had once despised. His life was filled with luxury, with power, but it was empty. He had no family, no close friends, nothing to anchor him in the world except for his business. And now, sitting across from these two children, he saw a glimpse of something he had long since forgotten. Vulnerability, innocence, the desperate need for someone to care. "Liam," Adrian said quietly, drawing the boy's attention. "Do you know where your father is?" Liam's expression darkened, and for a moment, Adrian thought he wouldn't answer. But then the boy shook his head. "He's gone. He left us a long time ago." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. No father, and now no mother. These children were alone in the world, just as Adrian had once been. The thought stirred something deep within him, something he didn't want to confront. He had spent his entire life building walls, keeping others out, protecting himself from the pain of loss and betrayal. But these children, Liam and Oliver, were breaking through those walls, one silent glance at a time. As the night wore on, the children grew tired. Adrian instructed one of his staff to prepare a guest room for them, and soon they were settled into a soft bed, far more comfortable than anything they had known in recent days. Liam refused to let go of his brother, even as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, his small body curled protectively around the baby. Adrian stood in the doorway of the room, watching them for a long moment. He felt a strange sense of responsibility, a weight on his shoulders that he hadn't anticipated. He had taken them in on a whim, driven by something he couldn't quite explain, but now that they were here, he knew There was no turning back. These children needed someone, and for reasons he couldn't yet fully understand, Adrian had decided that someone would be him. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked the same as he always had, calm, composed, in control. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Something he hadn't felt in a long time, if ever. The next morning, Adrian Faulkner awoke earlier than usual. His nights were typically restless, filled with thoughts of business deals, stock markets, and endless strategies to further his empire. But today, something different stirred in his mind, something that had nothing to do with his wealth or his business. The image of Liam, protectively curled around his younger brother Oliver, lingered in his thoughts, pushing out any space for his usual concerns. He found himself standing at the door of the guest room, almost out of habit, watching the two boys still fast asleep. Liam's face, even in sleep, looked far too serious for a child his age. His brow was furrowed, as if his mind was carrying the weight of the world, even in his dreams. Oliver, the baby, was tucked safely in his brother's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with soft, even breaths. Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had shifted in his life the moment he had taken those boys in. It was a feeling he wasn't comfortable with, something that gnawed at the edges of his carefully controlled existence. He had built his life around not caring, not feeling too much. But now, standing there, he realized he was in uncharted waters. He shook his head and turned away, heading downstairs to where his staff was already preparing breakfast. The clattering of plates and the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted him, along with the sight of his housekeeper, Ms. Carrington, hovering nervously by the kitchen door. She had worked for him for years, always efficient and discreet, but today she looked uneasy. "Good morning, sir," she said, glancing toward the stairs. "I assume the children will be joining you for breakfast?" Adrian paused, a little thrown by the question. He hadn't considered the logistics of what having these children in his home would entail. They were still strangers in his world, and he was still adjusting to their sudden presence. He hadn't thought beyond the immediate act of bringing them in from the cold. "Yes," he said, finally, feeling a strange sense of responsibility settling over him. "They'll be joining us. Make sure they have everything they need." Ms. Carrington gave a quick nod and hurried off to make the necessary preparations. Adrian walked over to the large windows overlooking the city. The skyline stretched out before him, a testament to his success, but for the first time it felt distant. The world outside seemed disconnected from the small but significant changes happening within the walls of his home. A few moments later, the sound of small footsteps caught his attention. He turned to see Liam standing at the bottom of the stairs, holding Oliver in his arms. The boy looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable in such opulent surroundings. Adrian couldn't blame him. This mansion, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, was worlds away from whatever life they had come from. "Good morning," Adrian said, trying to sound welcoming, though he wasn't sure how. His voice came out stiff, more like a businessman addressing an employee than a man greeting children who had slept under his roof. Liam hesitated, then nodded. "Good morning, sir." Adrian gestured to the dining table. "Sit down. Breakfast will be ready soon." Liam shifted Oliver in his arms and walked over to the table, sitting down carefully as if he didn't quite believe he belonged there. Adrian watched him, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He was used to people deferring to him, to them feeling out of place in his presence, but this was different. This wasn't about power or status. It was about something much deeper, something far more human. As they sat down, Miss Carrington brought out a tray of food: scrambled eggs, toast, fruit, and juice. Liam's eyes widened at the sight of the feast before him. Adrian realized with a pang of discomfort that this was probably more food than the boy had seen in days. "Eat as much as you like," Adrian said, trying to break the tension. "There's plenty." Liam nodded, but he was cautious, taking small bites, as if he was afraid it might all disappear if he ate too quickly. Oliver, still drowsy from sleep, fussed a little in his brother's arms, and Liam gently rocked him, murmuring soothing words that were barely audible. Adrian watched them in silence. He had never imagined himself in a situation like this. Children were not part of his plan. His life had been built around efficiency and control, and children, especially ones like Liam and Oliver, didn't fit into that equation. Yet here they were, in his home, eating at his table and disrupting the very order he had spent years perfecting. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Liam spoke. "Thank you for letting us stay, sir. We didn't know where else to go."
His voice was soft, but it carried a weight far beyond his years. Adrian glanced at him, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to gratitude that came from such a raw place. Most people thanked him because they wanted something: business deals, connections, or favors. But Liam's gratitude was different. It was born out of desperation, out of the relief that someone had finally cared enough to help.
"You don't have to thank me," Adrian said, though the words felt strange coming out of his mouth. "I couldn't just leave you out there." Liam looked down at his plate, his small hands nervously fidgeting with a piece of toast. Adrian sensed that the boy had more to say, but was unsure how to say it. "Where's your mother, Liam?" Adrian asked, his voice gentle but probing. He knew he had to ask, even if the answer would be painful. Liam hesitated, his shoulders tensing. He kept his gaze on Oliver, refusing to meet Adrian's eyes. "I don't know," he whispered. "She left us at the bus station and said she'd be back, but she didn't come." There it was. The truth, as stark and cold as the night Adrian had found them. He could hear the pain in Liam's voice, the confusion of a child trying to understand why his mother had left and why she hadn't returned. Adrian had seen many things in his life, but the look of abandonment in Liam's eyes was something he wasn't prepared for. "We waited for her," Liam continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But after a while I knew she wasn't coming back. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't let Oliver get sick, so I tried to keep us warm. I didn't want him to die." The rawness of Liam's words hit Adrian harder than he expected. The boy wasn't just surviving, he was trying to protect his baby brother in a world that had left them both behind. It was an unimaginable burden for someone so young, and yet Liam had carried it without complaint. "I'm sorry," Adrian said quietly, though he knew that no words could truly comfort the boy. "You shouldn't have had to go through that." Liam didn't respond. He just nodded slightly, still focused on Oliver, who had fallen asleep again in his arms. The baby, blissfully unaware of the turmoil around him, seemed to be the only thing keeping Liam grounded. Adrian was at a loss. He had spent years dealing with difficult situations, solving problems that seemed insurmountable, but this was different. He didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know how to make it right. All he knew was that he couldn't send these boys away. Not now. Not after hearing the fear and responsibility in Liam's voice. "We'll figure it out," Adrian said, more to himself than to Liam. "We'll make sure you and Oliver are safe." Liam glanced up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. He wanted to believe Adrian, but the world had taught him not to trust easily. Adrian couldn't blame him. Trust was a fragile thing, and once broken, it was nearly impossible to repair. At that moment, the doorbell rang, cutting through the silence. Adrian stood up, his mind already shifting back into problem-solving mode. "I'll be right back," he said, leaving the table and heading toward the front door. When he opened it, he found a woman standing there, Detective Emma Richards, a no-nonsense, sharp-eyed investigator who had crossed paths with Adrian before in various legal matters. She looked up at him with a calm but determined expression. "Mr. Faulkner," she said, her voice professional but not unfriendly. "I'm here to follow up on a report of 2 missing children." Adrian's stomach tightened. He had expected the authorities to get involved at some point, but now that they were here, he wasn't sure how he felt about it. These children, Liam and Oliver, had already been through enough. The thought of them being taken away, thrown into a system where they might be separated, filled him with a sense of dread. "Come in," Adrian said, stepping aside to let Detective Richards enter. She nodded and stepped into the foyer, taking in the surroundings with a quick glance before turning her attention back to Adrian. "We received a report from a woman claiming her children were missing. She said she left them at a bus station but didn't come back. I'm here to see if those children are the ones currently staying with you." Adrian's mind raced. He didn't know the full story yet, why their mother had left them, what circumstances had driven her to abandon her children. But he couldn't shake the feeling that sending them back, at least without understanding the situation, would be a mistake. "They're here," Adrian said after a moment. "But I'd like to speak with you before you see them." Detective Richards raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course." Adrian led her into his office, closing the door behind them. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what would likely be a difficult conversation. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what was best for his image, his business, or his reputation. He was thinking about what was best for 2 frightened, abandoned children who had no one else to look out for them. "I found them last night," Adrian began, recounting the events as clearly and truthfully as he could. He told Detective Richards about the bus station, about how he had taken the boys in, and about Liam's heartbreaking confession that his mother hadn't come back. Detective Richards listened quietly, her expression unreadable, but when Adrian finished, she sighed. "It's not uncommon, unfortunately. Parents get overwhelmed, especially in difficult situations, and sometimes they make bad decisions. I'll need to speak with the boys to get a better understanding of what's going on, but I understand your concern."
Adrian nodded, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had never been in a situation like this where the stakes were so personal, so immediate. He wasn't just dealing with numbers or contracts, he was dealing with lives, fragile and vulnerable lives. "I don't want them separated," Adrian said firmly. "Liam is terrified of losing his brother. If there's any way to keep them together, I want to make sure that happens."
Detective Richards studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "You've grown attached to them, haven't you?" Adrian opened his mouth to protest, but the truth was undeniable. He had grown attached far more quickly than he ever thought possible. These boys, with their tragic story and their quiet resilience, had slipped past the walls he had built around himself. He wasn't sure how, but they had. "I suppose I have," he admitted, though it felt strange to say it out loud. Detective Richards gave him a small, almost sympathetic smile. "Let me talk to them. We'll figure out what's best." Adrian Faulkner found himself pacing in his office after Detective Emma Richards went to speak with Liam and Oliver. His usually calm demeanor was slipping, his mind racing through the possible outcomes of her conversation with the boys. He wasn't accustomed to this feeling, this lack of control. In his business world, he could predict outcomes, plan for contingencies, but here, with these children and their uncertain fate, everything was unpredictable. He had tried to convince himself that his interest in their well-being was simply the right thing to do, an act of decency. But deep down, Adrian knew it was more than that. Something about Liam and Oliver had struck a chord within him, something he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. It wasn't just pity, it was a protective instinct, one that had surfaced almost as soon as he saw the fear in Liam's eyes. After what felt like an eternity, there was a knock on his office door. He straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure, and opened the door to find Detective Richards standing there. Her expression was neutral, professional, but he could sense there was something weighing on her mind. "They're both still in the dining room," she said, as she stepped into the office, her tone measured. "Liam's a tough kid, but he's holding a lot inside." Adrian nodded, not surprised by her assessment. "What did he tell you?" "He's scared," she replied, folding her arms. "And not just because of what's happened in the past few days. He's scared for Oliver. I think he's been protecting his brother for longer than we know. The bond between them is strong, and he's terrified of being separated from him." Adrian felt that same heaviness in his chest that had been growing since the moment he first saw them. "What happens now?" Detective Richards hesitated, a rare sign of uncertainty from a woman who usually exuded confidence. "Their mother is missing," she said finally. "Liam told me a bit more about their home life, and it's clear they've been neglected for some time. She's been in and out of their lives, and it sounds like she's involved in some dangerous activities. We're looking into it, but for now, I don't think it's safe to return them to her. The situation is too unstable." Adrian wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or even more anxious. "So what do we do? Put them in the system? Foster care?" Detective Richards gave him a long, thoughtful look before speaking. "There's another option," she said slowly, as though considering her words carefully. "Temporary guardianship. It would mean they could stay here with you while we continue investigating their situation. It would keep them out of the system, at least for now." Adrian blinked, caught off guard. He had expected the conversation to head toward some bureaucratic solution, but temporary guardianship? That was not something he had considered. He had already upended his life to bring these children into his home, and now he was being asked to take on a greater responsibility. I'm not sure if I'm the right person for that," Adrian said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they didn't ring true. Something inside him was already pulling him toward the decision, toward the idea of protecting them himself. Detective Richards stepped closer, her voice calm but direct. "You may not think you're the right person, but from what I've seen, you're the only person Liam trusts right now. That boy has been through enough. He doesn't need more uncertainty, more upheaval. He needs stability. And for some reason, he feels safe with you." Adrian's mind whirled with conflicting thoughts. His life was built on structure, on a carefully managed schedule. How could he possibly care for two young children when his world was so far removed from theirs? But then he thought of Liam's eyes, so full of fear, but also hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this time someone wouldn't abandon him. "I'll do it," Adrian said, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. "I'll take them in, for as long as they need." Detective Richards nodded, her expression softening. "I'll make the arrangements. We'll have to go through some formalities, but in the meantime, you should prepare for the long haul. This might not be over any time soon." As she left the room, Adrian stood there for a moment, letting the weight of his decision settle in. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let these boys down, not like everyone else in their lives had. Later that evening, Adrian sat with the boys in the living room, trying to navigate the unfamiliar role of caretaker. Liam was still quiet, watching Adrian with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, while Oliver played on the floor with a toy one of the staff had brought for him. It was a peaceful scene, but Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was looming just beyond the horizon. The calm didn't last long. 2 days later, things took a dangerous turn. Detective Richards had been working quietly behind the scenes, digging into the boys' background and trying to track down their mother. What she discovered was far worse than anyone had anticipated. Their mother had been involved with Victor Armitage, Adrian's former business partner, the same man whose betrayal had shaped Adrian's ruthless approach to life. Victor's downfall hadn't been a clean break. After their partnership ended, he had gotten involved in illegal activities, and now it seemed that the boys were somehow caught in the middle of his criminal web. It wasn't just their mother's neglect that was the issue, it was the danger they were in because of Victor's connections. The revelation hit Adrian like a sledgehammer. He had always known Victor was capable of underhanded tactics, but he hadn't realized the extent of the man's descent into the criminal underworld. Worse still, it appeared that Liam and Oliver were potential pawns in whatever game Victor and his associates were playing. "I can't believe this," Adrian muttered, pacing back and forth in his office after hearing the news from Detective Richards. "Victor, he's involved in this? With children?" Detective Richards nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. It looks like their mother was tangled up in his business dealings, and now that she's disappeared, whoever's left in his network might see the boys as leverage. If anyone figures out they're here with you..." Adrian didn't need her to finish the sentence. The implications were clear. If Victor's associates discovered that the children were in Adrian's care, they could become targets. This wasn't just about guardianship or temporary protection anymore. This was about survival. "We need to move them," Adrian said, his voice sharp with urgency. "They're not safe here, not with what's at stake."
Detective Richards nodded. "I've already started making arrangements for a secure location. We'll move them as soon as possible. But Adrian, this isn't going to be easy. Victor's people are smart and they're connected. They'll be watching."
Adrian's jaw clenched. He had spent years building a fortress around himself, both figuratively and literally, but this situation was spiraling into territory he couldn't fully control. For the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable. Vulnerable not for himself, but for the boys who had somehow become a central part of his life in such a short time. He wasn't about to let Victor or anyone else harm them. The days that followed were tense. Adrian worked closely with Detective Richards to arrange for the boys' safety. They moved them to a secluded estate owned by one of Adrian's subsidiaries, a place far from the city and prying eyes. Adrian made the decision to stay with them, unwilling to leave their protection to anyone else. But even in this new location, the tension never fully lifted. Adrian could feel it in the air, the threat, the danger lurking just beyond their reach. It was a strange, unnerving feeling for a man who had spent most of his life wielding power and control. Now, all he could do was wait, protect, and hope that the storm would pass without reaching them. One night, after Liam and Oliver had gone to bed, Adrian sat in the living room of the secluded estate, staring into the fire. The crackling flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, but the warmth did little to ease the cold knot of anxiety in his chest. His mind was racing with thoughts of Victor, of the boys, of the danger they were in. As he sat there, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Detective Richards. "We've got a lead on Victor's associates. Be ready, things could escalate soon." Adrian's heart pounded as he read the message. It was the confirmation of what he had feared. The danger was closer than ever. He stood up and paced, trying to think of what to do next. He had already committed to protecting Liam and Oliver, but now the stakes were higher than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about providing a safe home or offering emotional support. This was about keeping them alive. As the days passed, Adrian's relationship with the boys deepened, even in the midst of the looming threat. He found himself growing more protective of them, more willing to step into the role of a father figure, even if it was a role he had never imagined for himself. He and Liam began to talk more, to share more about their lives. Liam's trust in Adrian grew slowly, cautiously, but it was there, a small flicker of hope in the boy's eyes that Adrian hadn't seen before. One afternoon, as they were walking through the gardens of the estate, Liam finally opened up about something that had been weighing on him for a long time. "Adrian," he said quietly, do you think we'll ever be safe again?"
Adrian stopped walking and looked down at Liam. The boy's face was serious, his eyes filled with questions that no child should have to ask. Adrian knelt down, meeting Liam at eye level.
"We'll find a way," Adrian said, his voice firm. "I promise you, Liam, we'll get through this. You and Oliver will be safe. No one is going to hurt you."
Liam stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, for the first time, Liam smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a moment that struck Adrian deeply, a reminder of why he had made the decision to take these boys in, why he had chosen to fight for them.
But the storm was still coming, and Adrian knew that the hardest battles were yet to be fought. As the days turned into weeks, life at the secluded estate took on a strange rhythm. Adrian Faulkner, who had always thrived in the fast-paced world of high finance, found himself adjusting to a life that was both slower and far more intense in other ways. The sprawling estate was quiet, isolated from the noise of the city and the dangers that lingered beyond its gates, but the sense of impending threat never fully faded. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the wind seemed to remind Adrian of the precarious situation he and the boys were in. The estate's staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew for security reasons, each one carefully vetted by Detective Richards. Adrian's security team was on high alert, patrolling the grounds day and night, ensuring that no one could approach undetected. But despite the precautions, there was no way to shake the lingering fear that something or someone might still find its way to them. For Liam and Oliver, the adjustment was particularly difficult. Liam remained watchful, always on edge, as though he expected the world to collapse around him at any moment. He clung to his role as protector of his younger brother, never straying far from Oliver, who had begun to walk on his own, but still relied on Liam's presence for comfort. The bond between the two boys was unbreakable, and Adrian often marveled at how fiercely Liam took care of his brother despite his own obvious fears and anxieties. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself stepping into a role he had never imagined: guardian, father figure, and protector. It was an entirely different kind of responsibility, one that came with a weight he hadn't anticipated. In his world, he had always been the decision-maker, the one who controlled outcomes with sharp precision. But here, with these children, his power was limited. He could protect them from the outside world, but he couldn't shield them from their memories or the emotional scars they carried. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Adrian sat in his study, staring at the paperwork spread across his desk. Detective Richards had left files for him to review, documents related to the investigation into Victor Armitage's criminal activities and the potential dangers still looming over the boys. It was a mountain of information, but as Adrian sifted through it, he found his mind wandering to the more personal side of the situation. The more time he spent with Liam and Oliver, the more he found himself thinking about their future, not just in terms of their safety, but in terms of their lives. Adopting the boys had become more than just an abstract idea. Over the past few weeks, Adrian had grown attached to them in ways he hadn't expected. He had watched Liam go from being suspicious and guarded to slowly, tentatively trusting him. Oliver, with his wide, innocent eyes, had started to treat Adrian like a constant presence in his life, someone who would be there when he woke up, someone who would tuck him in at night. These were things Adrian had never thought he would experience, let alone crave. But now that he had them, the idea of losing the boys seemed unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that despite all the danger, this had become more than just a temporary situation. The boys needed him, and in a way, he needed them too. As he mulled over the papers in front of him, his phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Detective Richards. She had been keeping him updated on the investigation, but the tone of her messages had grown increasingly urgent in recent days. "We have new intel," the message read. "Victor's associates are getting desperate. They know the boys are still out there. We need to be prepared for anything."
Adrian clenched his jaw, a surge of anger rising within him. He had always despised Victor for his betrayal, but now the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about business or pride. This was about the lives of two innocent children who had been caught in the crossfire of a man's greed and ambition.
He immediately called Detective Richards, his voice low but tense. "How bad is it?" "It's escalating," she replied, her tone grim. "Victor's associates are scrambling to cover their tracks, and they know the boys are a loose end. We've intercepted some chatter that suggests they might make a move soon. We've increased security, but Adrian, we can't keep them hidden forever. Eventually, something's going to give."
Adrian ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "What's our next move? We can't just sit here waiting for them to strike."
"I'm working on it," she said. "But right now, we need to make sure the boys are safe. I don't want to alarm you, but I think it's time we consider relocating them again, somewhere even more secure." Adrian's gut twisted at the thought of uprooting the boys again. They had only just started to settle into a routine, to feel a semblance of normalcy in their lives, and now that too was being threatened. "I'll do whatever it takes," Adrian said, his voice hard with resolve. "I won't let anything happen to them." The conversation with Detective Richards left Adrian on edge. He didn't sleep much that night, his mind spinning with thoughts of Victor's associates, of the danger that seemed to be closing in around them. Every shadow outside the estate, every distant sound felt like a potential threat. The next morning, Adrian sat at the breakfast table with Liam and Oliver, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of distress in the boys. They were quiet, as usual, but Adrian could sense the underlying tension, especially in Liam. The boy's eyes darted around the room, always watching, always wary. He was a child, but he had the instincts of someone who had been through too much too soon. As they ate, Adrian tried to make conversation, though small talk was still something he struggled with. He had spent so many years focused on business, on negotiations and strategic plans, that he found it difficult to talk about everyday things. But he knew he had to try for the boys. "Do you like it here?" Adrian asked, directing the question to Liam. "Is there anything you need? Anything we can do to make you more comfortable?" Liam looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing slightly. He seemed hesitant to answer, as though he didn't want to admit any discomfort. "It's nice here," he said quietly. "It's safe." Adrian nodded, but he could hear the unspoken fear in Liam's voice. Safe was relative, especially when the outside world was still such a threat. "Listen," Adrian said, leaning forward slightly. "I know things have been hard lately, and I know you've been looking out for your brother. But you don't have to do it alone. You're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm going to make sure nothing happens to you or Oliver." Liam's eyes met Adrian's, and for a brief moment, Adrian saw a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or at least the desire to believe what he was hearing. But Liam had been through too much to trust easily, and Adrian knew that. Still, the boy gave a small nod, as though he was willing to accept Adrian's words, if only for the time being. The day passed uneventfully, but Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that something was building beneath the surface, something dangerous. His security team was on high alert, and Detective Richards had promised to keep him updated on any new developments, but there was only so much they could do from within the estate's walls. The real threat was out there, beyond their control, and it was only a matter of time before it reached them. That evening, as the sun began to set, Adrian received a call from Detective Richards. Her voice was tense, more so than he had ever heard before. "We've got a problem," she said. "There's been movement. Victor's associates are mobilizing. We think they've figured out where the boys are." Adrian's heart raced. "How close are they?" "They're not far," she replied. "I'm sending reinforcements, but Adrian, you need to be ready. They're coming." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Everything he had feared was now unfolding. The danger he had been trying to keep at bay was closing in, and there was no time left to think or plan. It was time to act. "I'll be ready," Adrian said, his voice steely. "But you need to hurry." He hung up the phone and immediately sprang into action. He called his head of security, issuing orders to lock down the estate and prepare for any potential breach. The staff, already on high alert, began securing the perimeter, while Adrian moved quickly through the house to find Liam and Oliver. The boys were in their room, playing quietly with a set of building blocks. They looked up as Adrian entered, sensing the urgency in his movements. "Come with me," Adrian said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We're moving to a safer part of the house. Just follow me, okay?" Liam's face tightened with worry, but he nodded, grabbing Oliver's hand. They followed Adrian through the estate, down a series of hallways that led to a secure, reinforced room at the back of the property. It was a safe room, designed for emergencies, and Adrian had never imagined he would actually need to use it. But now, with the threat of Victor's associates looming closer, it was the only option. As they entered the room, Adrian locked the door behind them, his mind racing. The walls were thick, the doors reinforced with steel. It was designed to withstand almost anything, but the feeling of being trapped inside still gnawed at him. Liam looked up at Adrian, his eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" Adrian knelt down in front of the boys, trying to keep his voice steady. "There are some bad people who might be coming, but we're safe here. No one can get in. I need you both to stay calm, okay?"
Oliver clung to Liam, clearly sensing the tension, while Liam's expression hardened. "I'll take care of him," Liam said quietly, his voice determined despite his fear.
Adrian nodded, feeling a surge of pride for the boy's bravery. "I know you will, but I'm going to take care of both of you." They sat in the safe room for what felt like hours, the air thick with tension. Adrian's phone buzzed intermittently with updates from Detective Richards, but there was little she could say to ease the growing sense of dread. The last message had been the worst. "They're close. Be ready." Adrian glanced at Liam and Oliver, both huddled together on the small couch. He felt a fierce protectiveness rise within him, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. This wasn't just about keeping them safe anymore. This was about fighting for their future, about ensuring that they had a life beyond the fear and danger that had consumed their childhood. And Adrian was willing to do whatever it took to give them that future. The sound of distant sirens filled the air, growing louder as they drew closer to the estate. The sound of distant sirens filled the air, growing louder as they drew closer to the estate. The sirens in the distance grew louder, a high-pitched wail that sent a shiver of tension through the walls of the estate. Inside the secure room, Adrian paced, his mind sharp with focus, but weighed down by the responsibility now sitting squarely on his shoulders. His phone remained in his hand, lighting up every few moments with updates from Detective Richards. Each buzz signaled a new development, though none were comforting. Victor's associates were closer than anyone had expected, closing in with frightening speed. Liam sat with Oliver on the small couch in the corner, his arms wrapped protectively around his brother. Despite his best efforts to appear calm, Adrian could see the fear etched into Liam's face, in the tight set of his jaw and the way his eyes flickered anxiously every time Adrian moved. Oliver, for his part, had drifted off to sleep, blissfully unaware of the looming danger, his tiny head resting against Liam's chest. Adrian's heart ached at the sight. These boys had been through so much already, more than any child should ever have to face. The weight of it all pressed heavily on Adrian, the knowledge that he was now the one standing between them and the monsters that lurked just beyond the estate walls. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was an urgent message from Richards. ETA 10 minutes, reinforcements inbound. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Keep them safe. Adrian glanced at the thick steel door that sealed the room. The estate's security was state-of-the-art, and the safe room had been built to withstand any external threats, but nothing in his carefully structured world had prepared him for this kind of danger. He wasn't just protecting assets or navigating a boardroom battle. This was a fight for life, for the future of 2 innocent children. He checked his watch, counting down the minutes in his head. 10 minutes felt like a lifetime. Every second stretched out, the tension inside the room thick enough to suffocate. Adrian's mind raced with every possible outcome. Would the reinforcements arrive in time? Would Victor's men even make it onto the estate? Or would the security team stop them before they got too close? "Adrian?" Liam's voice broke the silence, trembling but steady. Adrian stopped pacing and turned to face the boy. Yes? Are we going to be okay? Liam asked, his voice low but laced with fear. His eyes searched Adrian's face for some hint of reassurance, something that could cut through the terror hanging over them. Adrian walked over and knelt in front of Liam, looking the boy directly in the eye. He wanted to be honest, but more than anything, he needed to give Liam hope. "I'm going to make sure you and Oliver are safe," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, I won't let anyone hurt you."
Liam nodded, though Adrian could tell that the boy was struggling to believe in a world where safety could be guaranteed. After everything he had been through, trust didn't come easily, and Adrian couldn't blame him. But still, the boy needed something to hold on to, and Adrian was determined to be that anchor. A sudden, sharp noise from outside the safe room made Adrian's heart jump. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the estate. His security team was out there, but the situation had escalated beyond even their capabilities. He could only hope that the reinforcements would arrive before Victor's associates breached the inner defenses. Adrian stood, his body tense, every muscle coiled in readiness. He moved toward the communication panel built into the wall of the safe room and activated the estate's internal security cameras. The monitor flickered to life, showing various angles of the estate grounds. Men dressed in black, clearly armed, were advancing on the property. His security team was engaging them, but it was clear that Victor's men were prepared for a fight. Adrian's pulse quickened as he watched the confrontation unfold. Gunfire echoed faintly through the thick walls of the estate. His guards were outnumbered, but they were holding their ground for the moment. Still, it wouldn't be long before the situation spiraled out of control. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Adrian's gaze shifted between the screen and the boys, knowing that the most critical moments were yet to come. His phone buzzed again. 5 minutes. The countdown continued, and all Adrian could do was wait. Wait and hope. A few minutes later, the security monitor showed a shift. Vehicles arrived at the edge of the property, reinforcements. Armed officers moved swiftly to support the security team. Adrian felt a flicker of relief, but he knew it wasn't over yet. Victor's men wouldn't back down easily, not after getting this close. Through the monitor, Adrian saw a group of Victor's associates retreating toward the far end of the property, trying to escape the advancing reinforcements. It seemed like the immediate threat was being contained, but he wasn't about to take any chances, not until Detective Richards confirmed it was safe. Another buzz from his phone. "It's clear. Stay put for now, but we've neutralized the threat." Adrian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in his chest eased slightly, but it wasn't gone. He knew this was just one battle in a larger war. The danger hadn't disappeared, it had only been delayed. He turned to Liam, who had been watching him closely, his expression unreadable. "It's okay now," Adrian said, his voice softer. "We're safe." Liam nodded, but his face remained tight with worry. "Are they gone?" "For now, yes," Adrian replied. "But we're going to stay in here a little longer just to be sure." Liam seemed to accept this, though his eyes remained vigilant. Adrian couldn't help but admire the boy's resilience. Despite everything, Liam had stayed strong for Oliver, for himself. But Adrian could see the cracks. The weight that Liam carried was too heavy for someone his age. They stayed in the safe room for another hour before Detective Richards arrived in person to escort them out. Her face was grim but determined as she updated Adrian on the situation. "We've taken care of the immediate threat," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "But this isn't over. Victor's network is still out there, and they'll keep looking for the boys.
We need to move them somewhere even more secure. Adrian's stomach sank. He had known this was coming, but the reality of it still hit hard. "Where?" he asked, his voice low. "I've already made arrangements," Richards replied. "A government-protected safe house, fully secure. No one will know they're there." Adrian's heart clenched. The idea of sending Liam and Oliver away, even if it was for their safety, was unbearable. Over the past weeks, they had become more than just wards in his care. They had become part of his life, part of him. But deep down, he knew what had to be done. "Will I be able to stay with them?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. Richards hesitated. "It's complicated. We can arrange for visits, but the location has to remain secret. It's for their protection, Adrian." Adrian nodded, though the thought of being separated from them gnawed at him. He had promised to protect them, and now he was being asked to step back, to trust that someone else could keep them safe. It felt wrong, but he knew he had no choice. Later that evening, Adrian sat with the boys one last time in the estate's garden. The air was cool, and the setting sun cast a warm, golden glow over the horizon. Liam and Oliver sat close to him, their small bodies radiating a sense of quiet resilience that both comforted and saddened him. "I have to tell you something," Adrian said gently, breaking the silence. "You're going to be moving to a new place. It's very safe, and no one will be able to find you there. But I won't be able to come with you right away."
Liam looked up sharply, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean? You're not coming?"
Adrian's chest tightened. He had never been good at these kinds of conversations, and he wasn't sure how to make it any easier for Liam to understand. "I'll visit as much as I can," he said, his voice soft. "But for now, it's important that you and Oliver are kept safe. That's the most important thing." Liam's expression hardened, and for a moment, Adrian saw the walls going back up, the same walls Liam had built around himself when they had first met. "You're leaving us," Liam whispered, the hurt clear in his voice.
"No," Adrian said firmly. "I'm not leaving you. I'm making sure you're safe. That's all I want, to keep you and Oliver safe." Liam didn't respond, but his eyes filled with tears that he quickly blinked away. Adrian's heart broke at the sight. He wished he could do more, that he could promise things would be different. But all he could offer was the truth.
The next morning came far too quickly. The boys were packed and ready, their belongings gathered into a small suitcase that somehow made the whole situation feel even more real. Detective Richards arrived early, her demeanor calm but urgent as she prepared to take them to the safe house. Adrian stood at the door, his hand resting on Liam's shoulder as the car pulled up. Oliver, still too young to understand the gravity of the situation, clung to Liam's leg, his wide eyes blinking sleepily. "You're going to be okay?" Adrian said softly, looking down at Liam. "I'll see you soon. I promise." Liam didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said enough. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to be separated from the only stable figure in his life. But he knew, just as Adrian did, that this was the only way to keep them safe. As they climbed into the car, Adrian felt a hollowness settle in his chest. He watched as the car drove away, disappearing down the long driveway and out of sight. The estate felt too quiet, too empty without them. For the first time in his life, Adrian understood what it meant to feel the weight of absence, of loss. Not the loss of business deals or financial success, but something far deeper. The loss of family. Days turned into weeks, and though Adrian kept himself busy with work, he couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him was missing. He visited the boys whenever the security protocols allowed, but the visits were short, filled with the constant reminder that they were still in hiding, still waiting for the danger to pass. Each visit, however brief, only strengthened the bond between Adrian and the boys. Liam, though still guarded, had begun to trust him again, and Oliver's laughter and energy brought light into the otherwise tense situation. But each time Adrian left the safe house, the ache of leaving them behind grew stronger. One afternoon, as Adrian was preparing for yet another visit, he received a call from Detective Richards. This time, her voice was different, relieved. "We've got him," she said, simply. "Victor, it's over."
The words hit Adrian like a wave of relief. The danger, the constant fear, it was finally over. Victor Armitage and his associates had been arrested, their criminal network dismantled. The boys were safe.
Adrian didn't waste any time. He drove straight to the safe house, his heart pounding with anticipation. When he arrived, Liam and Oliver were waiting for him, their faces lit up with smiles that warmed Adrian's heart in a way he hadn't expected. "It's over," he told them, his voice filled with emotion. "You're safe now. You can come home." Liam's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really? We can go back?"
Adrian nodded, his own heart swelling with the knowledge that they were finally free from the shadows that had haunted them for so long. "Yes. You're coming home with me."
The drive back to the estate was filled with a quiet, joyful energy. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no fear, no lingering sense of danger. The boys had come through the storm, and they were finally heading toward a future where they could just be children again. When they arrived at the estate, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the grounds. Liam and Oliver ran through the front door, their laughter echoing through the halls. Adrian watched them, a smile tugging at his lips. He had never imagined his life would take this turn, that he would become a father figure to two boys who had needed him as much as he needed them. As they sat down for dinner that evening, the sense of family was undeniable. The long journey, filled with danger, uncertainty, and fear, had led them here, to this moment of peace and belonging. For the first time in his life, Adrian felt whole, not because of his wealth or his success, but because of the two boys sitting across from him, their eyes filled with trust, with hope, and with love. In the weeks that followed, Adrian finalized the adoption papers. It wasn't just about formalizing what had already become reality. It was about giving Liam and Oliver the security and stability they deserved. They were no longer just two abandoned children trying to survive. They were home. They were family. The day the adoption became official, Adrian stood in the courthouse with Liam and Oliver at his side. The judge smiled as he signed the final documents, making it official. Adrian was now, in every sense of the word, their father. As they left the courthouse, Liam looked up at Adrian, his eyes shining with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "So, we're really staying forever?" Adrian smiled, his heart full. "Yes, forever." Liam's smile was radiant, and for the first time, Adrian saw the weight lift from the boy's shoulders. The fear, the uncertainty, it was gone. They were a family now, and nothing would ever change that. In the months that followed, life settled into a new normal. The estate, once a symbol of Adrian's wealth and power, had become a home filled with laughter, with warmth, and with love. Liam and Oliver thrived in their new life, free from the shadows of their past. And Adrian, who had spent so many years building walls around himself, finally found what he had been missing all along: a family. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were challenges, moments of doubt, but through it all, they had each other. And that was enough. As Adrian tucked the boys into bed one night, Liam looked up at him, his voice soft but full of emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. Adrian smiled, his heart full. "You don't have to thank me, Liam. You're my son. I love you. Both of you."
Liam's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. "I love you too, Dad."
The words hit Adrian with a force he hadn't expected, but they filled him with a sense of peace and fulfillment he had never known. As he left their room and turned off the lights, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They were a family now, a real family. And that, Adrian realized, was the greatest success of all.